Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to discuss the ether to include offering you a tangible solution to this age-old mystery. Let's begin by identifying the root problem, and that is the problem of incommensurability. Now, from a formal point of view, this means that all the different theories postulated over the course of time operate within their own frameworks. These frameworks are known as paradigms. In turn, each paradigm imposes its own framework of language called a lexicon. As such, these theories or paradigms are unable to talk to one another. In common terms, this means that everyone is talking about the exact same thing, just from different points of view and using different languages. Probably the most recognized in history is from the biblical point of view, with the story of the Tower of Babel and the subsequent confusion of tongues. And there is a goodly amount of examples of incommensurability. For example, if you as an American were to travel to India, then you would find yourself in a world totally different from what you're used to in America. The language is different, the clothes are different, the food is different, the architecture is different, human mannerisms are different. You would be like a fish out of the ocean. This is an example of you being culturally incommensurable. However, these things can be overcome with language translators, cultural immersion courses, and so on and so forth. Another example of incommensurability can be seen within the educational framework or paradigm. Take, for example, the liberal arts such as grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Now, on the surface, they may seem to be different, incommensurable subjects, but fundamentally, we're talking about the same thing. And that same thing is philosophy. This is why in all of these subjects and many more, you earn a PhD, which is a philosophical doctorate. And here's a good 10,000 foot view perspective of what it means to be incommensurable, as every one of the following examples are simply different names for the ether, as told from their varying cultural perspectives and their respective filters called languages throughout the course of time. Let us begin on the left of your slide with the Western world. In archaic Greece, the ether was called arche, which meant the first principle or first element or the ultimate underlying substance. The pre-Socratic philosopher named Anaximander called it aperon, which means that which is unlimited, boundless, infinite, or indefinite. And its corresponding shape, the epeirogon, which is a polygon with an infinite number of sides. And aeon means forever, which is its corollary Hellenistic personification of the god Aeon, who was an orb that encircled the zodiac, and for that matter, the universe. And in ancient Greece, we find the proper name ether, which translates as pure air or clear sky. And in Hellenic Greece, Aristotle called it both ether and substratum. During the Renaissance, the ether was known as the fifth element, also known as the quintessence. In the following age of enlightenment, the ether gained the more grandiose name stylized the luminiferous ether. Following into the mid-19th century, Baron Karl von Reichenbach coined the term odic force, and taking the ether out of the abstract space and placing it into the physical world, we have such variations as the mystical Greek metal called adamantium, as well as many geologic variants to include the indestructible emerald tablet of Hermes and the ever sought after philosopher's stone. Now to the right of your slide, we also have many conceptual versions in the Far East, beginning with Confucius's Wu Wei, the Chinese Qi or Qi, and the Japanese Ku. And the Hindus have many versions to include Akasha, which is the Sanskrit term for ether, space, and or light, Prana, which is the life force or vital principle that permeates all reality, Prakriti, which is the primary substance, and also Purusha, which is a universal principle that is eternal, indestructible, without form, and all-pervasive. And physical variations also exist in the Eastern world to include Buddhist Chintamani jewel and the Hindu Shamanti jewel, both from the geologic point of view. And there are so many others. At the bottom left of your slide, we can also find many contemporary versions of the ether. The general scientific term used is energy, which is an Aristotelian word which means work, And from the point of view of electromagnetism, the ether is synonymous with the electromagnetic field, which science has yet to successfully define. And in the field of radiometry, the ether is akin to radiant energy with a symbol QE, high Q, and through the eyes of a cosmologist is called cosmic background radiation. Now, in classical mechanics, best defined as atomism, everything is composed of atoms, which are the ether from this viewpoint, but in contemporary times, this model was realized to be lacking, so they concocted something called dark matter, which would be akin to a counterweight called anti-ether. Now, this model has been made almost irrelevant with the birth of the paradigm called quantum mechanics, and in this fledgling quagmire of a model, the ether poses as quantum foam, quantum bubbles, quantum soup, and many other variations. And finally, if we wish to look at the ether from a purely theoretical point of view, it represents itself as the grand unification theory, which promises to unify everything, or in other words, make everything commensurable. So as you can see, there are many versions of the ether, and even this isn't nearly a complete list. And here we can restate our primary problem, which is incommensurability, which in common terms requires us to figure out how to make all these different versions talk to one another. And we're going to do just that. And in order to do so, we must first take the most general point of view of the ether, and that is as everything. And if you want to put a face on it, or rather more properly, a consciousness into it, it is called God, and this includes them all. Now, if the ether and or God is, then it must be everything. And logic tells us this, as the ether is what gives rise to all other elements. So this statement holds true. Next, we can continue the thought and ask, well, what is everything? And the one thing we scientifically know for certain is that everything is energy. And as simple as that, ladies and gentlemen, we have brought the abstraction of everything down into something scientifically tangible we call energy. From here, we can pose the next logical question. Well, what is energy? And the one thing we know for sure is that energy is electromagnetism or electromagnetic force, also known as light. And here you can see that we have successfully bridged 5 versions of the ether, and as electromagnetism, we can formulate and construct a tangible scientific model in our physical reality. Thank you, science. So what do we know about electromagnetism? Well, science tells us that an electromagnetic wave is composed of a positive polarity and a negative polarity. The positive polarity is what crests, highlighted in red, and the negative polarity is what troughs, highlighted in blue. Now, the point that eludes most people is that at the exact center of the wave is a point of conversion where the positive polarity converts or flips into the negative polarity, and that exact point is neutral. You can think of it as the neutral polarity or a standing point of neutral resonance, but truly is a polarity of no polarity. Kind of like 0 is a realistic number but technically not a number, or 1 is a realistic prime but technically not a prime. Now, in order to further explore this wave, let's switch from the electromagnetic point of view to a mathematical point of view. So just as the wave is a circle, we can see that the point of neutrality corresponds with 180 degrees around the circle, which equates to the mathematical constant of pi. So what do we know about pi? Well, pi is an infinite, hyperrational, and transcendental number. Take note of the language. And in mathematics, we have a fundamental concept called the limit or supremum of a number. The concept simply states that if an infinite number series, such as a constant, is converging towards another number, and although counterintuitive, then technically it is considered that number. Perhaps the best counterintuitive example of this Archimedean property is with the rigorous mathematical proof that 1 is the exact same number as 0.999 ad infinitum. Now pi equates to 3.14 followed by an infinite string of numbers. And each number we calculate actually gets us closer to the number 4, but never touches it. An example, 3.141 is closer to 4, 3.1415 is still even closer to 4, 3.14159265358 is much closer to 4, we can see that we can close in on the infinite converge on 4, but still we never reach 4. This means that 4 is the limit or supremum of pi. Now that you have an understanding of this counterintuitive yet proven mathematical concept, let's blend in the mathematical point of view with the electromagnetic point of view. And this time we will look at the wave from the first dimension, which is the most basic point of view. Here I can depict the wave as a one-dimensional line with the positive polarity extending to the right in red, the negative polarity retracting from the left in blue, and the point of neutrality permeating the center, which is depicted in purple. Or from the mathematical point of view, we can say the 1 in red, the 2 in blue, and the 3 or pi depicted in purple. So just as we counterintuitively learn that pi equals 4, we can also display 4 as a green background surrounding the wave, which in this linear depiction entails that the sum total of all waves is the neutral limit of 4, depicted in green. And here is a modified one-dimensional variant to help you further understand this concept. And in the second dimension, this knowledge directly translates to circling the square, where the circle represents 1 through pi, and the square represents the circle's inverse limit of 4. It is also worthy to note that you can conduct an easy check on learning in the second dimension, as both the circle and the square each contain 360 degrees. So let's go back to our standard point of view of the electromagnetic waveform. Now, just as the counterintuitive rules found within mathematics, let's go over a counterintuitive rule found within electric theory, yet provably true. Now, a waveform of infinite duration, which means it has an infinite number of cycles, can be analyzed with absolute precision. But the less cycles available for analysis, the less precise the analysis. It is only when we have an equation describing a waveform in its entirety that Fourier analysis can reduce it to a definite series of sinusoidal waveforms. The fewer times that a wave cycles, the less certain its frequency. Taking this concept to its logical extreme, a short pulse, which is a waveform that doesn't even complete a cycle, actually has no frequency or zero frequency, and so rather it acts as an infinite range of frequencies. So to put this in common terms, if you pick out any point along this one waveform, it will have an opposite point that cancels itself out. In fact, any and every point that you pick along the wave will have an equal and opposite point that cancels each other out. This means that the wave has a frequency of 0 and thus by default is all frequencies. So to illustrate this concept with our wave, here is the one wave that acts as every wave. In other words, the totality of waves or frequencies is the ether. And from the numerical point of view, the green light in the background is the number 4, which you may recognize as the first perfect square. So while all of this may sound slightly technical and certainly sounds counterintuitive, let's just say it in common terms. What is the ether? Well, it's light, which is the one thing that is everything, as expressed from its four-folded form. You could also say that it's one expressed as from the point of view of 4, or you could say that it's everything expressed from its quartering, or you could say that it's radiance expressed from its quadrants. However, the absolute most important way to express this is as God, because it is God, expressed as a quadrinity, and this is actually the way I prefer to view God. And merging the numeric and chromatic point of views, here's how the ancient Chinese beautifully captured the concept within the Tao Te Ching, chapter 42, which says, "The way gave birth to unity. Unity gave birth to duality. Duality gave birth to Trinity. Trinity gave birth to the myriad creatures. The myriad creatures bear yin on their backs and embrace yang in their bosoms. They neutralize these vapors and thereby achieve harmony. Now, from the etymological point of view, that is beyond linear etymology. Let's take a look at some etheric words, which are words that inherently express the symbolic fourfolded form of light. Please note that this is only an introductory into this phenomenon within language, and that I have arranged the following words in an order that allow you to best capture their essence. There are many different kinds of years. There are solar years, lunar years, great years, etc. But the general concept of the year is ruled by the ether, which also rules the era, being a period of 2,160 years. And in the same context, the ether also rules the largest fractal order of magnitude called the universal year, composed of 311 trillion 40 billion years. And the exact center of it all is the earth, which is a fractal order of magnitude of your heart, which is metaphysically known to be your third ear. Can you hear? If you can, when your heart is weighed and measured by the Father, it will prove to be lighter than a feather. And inside the theater of your heart is where you must forge your art in the heat of its hearth, bringing forth Ea, the Akkadian earth god. Rhea is the Greek earth goddess, and her daughter Hera. So here you can see that all these words exhibit the fourfolded quality of light, because light is everything, to include the very words you both write and speak. Now let's look at another string of etheric words, which have the number 4 and all its variants, such as 4, F-O-R, 4, F-O-U-R, 4, F-O-R-E, and it is this fourness that brings form to terra firma, that is the earth. And with a self-check on learning, you may notice that the earth has 4 corners, 4 winds, and your heart has 4 ventricles. So to conclude this slide, the point is that from a hyperlinguistic point of view, it's about the essence of the words. And this is a very small portion of inherently etheric words for you to explore. And if you want a scientific point of view of the ether, here are the words of a proven scientific genius. Leaving the realm of language and diving into the world of form, also called geometry, which is the measure of the earth, our first stop is with the platonic solids. These three-dimensional shapes are the only 5 regular polyhedra, which means they are the only 5 that have congruent faces, points, and edges. As a consequence, they are also the only 5 three-dimensional shapes that are perfectly balanced within a sphere, and in fact the only 5 shapes that are perfectly balanced within 3 consecutive spheres, those being a circumscribed sphere, a mid-sphere, and an inscribed sphere. Here you can see the 3 spheres of a tetrahedron. Now this is an amazing and unique property of the platonic solids. However, in regard to spheres, one of these solids has an even more unique property, and that is the dodecahedron, which is the only single 3-dimensional shape that can perfectly cover a sphere with no overlaps or gaps. This makes it the only platonic solid that can tessellate space. In other words, this means that the dodecahedron and space itself are congruent with one another, or commensurable. Now, this knowledge was said to have been the greatest secret of the Pythagoreans, and from which Hippasus was killed at sea. And Plato remarked on the dodecahedron that God used it for arranging the constellations on the whole heaven. And if you have ever wondered where or why the Egyptians conceived of a hieroglyphic 5-pointed star that symbolized both star gods and the constellations, now you know. And when you arrange pi in a circle, pi of course being the hyperrational number that defines a circle, you get this beautiful, ordered, and harmoniously resonating pattern of pentagons within the circle. Now in the West we call them platonic solids. However, in the East, and specifically Hindu philosophy, they're called the Pancha Mahabhuta, which means the 5 great elements. Now, even though Plato's Theaetetus is the first documented mathematical description of all five Platonic solids, followed by Euclid's complete mathematical descriptions, the spiritual understanding of the Platonic solids in the West are rather immature in comparison to the Hindu knowledge. An example, Plato barely scratched the surface and only went so far as to syncretize the Platonic solids to their corresponding elements, while the Hindus had and still has a very mature knowledge that not only synchronizes the elements, but also puts the proper deities with the consorts, the human body components, the associated fingers, the sense organs, and their characteristic principles. Now, I would like you to pay particular attention to the dodecahedron. Notice that this geometric shape represents both space and ether. This is because space and ether are two different names for the exact same thing. And while in the West, the immature point of view of space is that of emptiness, the ancient Hindus fully understood that space was not empty at all, but rather filled, and I mean literally to the last quanta, and teeming with electromagnetic energy. Next, notice that the associated deities with the dodecahedron is Akasha, who in conceptual form is the Akashic record, and Dyaus, who in the West is known as Dyaus Pater, or Sky Father, or Zeus. And it would do us well to remember that Zeus wields the thunderbolt, and it is the ears that are associated with the dodecahedron. Knowing this hyper-rational formula, we can easily correlate and transpose the Greek and Roman gods, which synchronize Ares and Mars with the tetrahedron, Aeolus and Eros, many others with the octahedron, Gaia, Rhea, Hera, and others with the hexahedron, Poseidon and his Roman equivalent Neptune with the icosahedron, and finally the dodecahedron belonging to Zeus and his Roman equivalent Jupiter, or Jupiter Zeus. And in the Christian religion, in any religion for that matter, are no exception to the fractal nature of hyperreality. For we can also transpose these deities as well, beginning from the right with Jupiter Zeus, or Jesus, and as you know, he and the Father are one, and his corollary opposition being Cephas, also known as Peter, and his inverted cross, which is the opposite of Jesus's upright hexahedral cross. For what is a three-dimensional hexahedron when flat-packed other than a two-dimensional cross? And this cross is made from your heart. This is the cross that Jesus told each of you that you must bear, as this cross requires you to have the self-responsibility to restrain yourself. This cross requires you to use your mind to balance your heart, complete the inner work of man, and attain true salvation. And in our Christian schema, the octahedron leaves no guesswork, as the New Testament specifically tells you that Lucifer is the chief choir leader and master of the principality of air. And lastly, the tetrahedron, which Jesus himself told you that the light of the body is the eye, and if it be single, then your body will be full of light. Now, another unique property of the Platonic solids is that they are dual inversions of one another. Take, for example, the icosahedron and the dodecahedron. Both of these can be nested within one another, with the dual being the center of the faces of the original. Connecting the centers of the adjacent faces in the original forms the edges of the dual and interchanges the number of faces and vertices while maintaining the number of edges. In other words, it inverts them. Or to say this from the Greek point of view, this is Zeus interlocked in battle with his watery brother Poseidon. Or from the Christian point of view, Jesus and his polar opposite Peter. And the same mathematical principles can be said about the octahedron and the hexahedron. And from the Christian point of view, this is equitable to Lucifer and the spiritual battle for your heart. Contemplate the 40 days of the temptation of Christ, and know that everyone on this earth gets the same offer that Jesus did. Now, just as the dodecahedron was the exception in the totality of tessellation or expansion, it is the tetrahedron that is the exception with inversion or compression. Thus, the extreme of exceptions act as bookends to the story of the Platonic solids. In specific, the tetrahedron is a self-dual, and combining it with the 180-degree opposition of itself leaves us with the star tetrahedron, probably best known as the Merkaba, which is associated with the earliest form of Jewish mysticism. And to have attained the Merkaba means you have ascended. Now, from the Hindu point of view, we actually have guiding words for your process of ascension, which in short states that you must enter a state of self-reflection and retract your five senses to a point where your sixth sense, which is your mind, represented by the all-seeing tetrahedron, will invert like a mirror and reflect back to God. And both my work and personal testimony stand as a living testament of this being absolutely true, because this is exactly how I did it. And just as their respective geometric polyhedral versions, light and its dual, water, hence the duat, are the exact dual inversions of one another and share the same correlative properties and characteristics. And here's a short list. Light and water are the only two elements we know of that are needed for life. And while light is the universal solution, water is the universal solvent. Water is a polar molecule, which means that both are electromagnetic. They are the only two common substances that exist as a solid, liquid, and gas. In particular, water is ice, water and vapor, and light has physical form, plasma, and electrostatic charge. They both exist in waveform, and as such, all wave-based phenomena apply. They also share such characteristics as current, mirror reflection, charge, flow, spin, and they are both tasteless and odorless, and for that matter, formless until housed in a vessel. And water has been scientifically shown to hold memory. Thank you, Dr. Emoto. And if you want proof that light holds memory, simply look in the mirror at your own reflection. They're both ionic. They're both cyclic. And to conclude our list, they are both the houses of stars. And remember, Sheba in Egyptian means star, while Shebayit means the way of true living. Contemplate this. And there are so many more correlations, and the most important was codified within the Hellenic Jews, which captured in their scriptures the following passages in Genesis. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, the water above is the diffuse, ethereal, electromagnetic light that fills the entirety of the heavens, and its corollary opposite is the condensed physical waters below that is so necessary to our life in this created corporeal realm. And just as the heavens, which have stars, and with the corollary below being water, which has stars, there is a middle corollary. That is you. Have no doubt, you are a star, and your human form is your vessel of light. From the moment of your conception, your cells began to divide, and while all other cells in your body are differentiated and susceptible to the life cycle of birth and death, the initial 64 cells, which is 4 cubed, remain unchanged throughout your entirety of human life. These initial cells were formed from one drop of your mother's blood. This undifferentiated cell matrix forms your flower of life, your very own star, and it lays in your heart, waiting to blossom from your bosom. And true to its form, your flower of life is the one geometric shape that holds all 5 platonic solids. And the ancients knew this, for the Greeks called you a celestial plant, or alternately an upside-down plant, whose root grew in the heavens. Thank you, Greece. And the Egyptians housed within their holy temples the platonic solids made from stone, and which were gods. And on the heels of this magnificent revelation, I'll conclude this presentation with one final observation about the ether. The symbol for ether is a stylized Q. Hi, Q.